Today we're going to look at understanding active voice and passive voice. When we're looking at what a voice is in your writing, let's define it. A voice is the form a verb takes to indicate whether the subject of the verb performs or receives the action. And there are two types of voice, the active voice and the passive voice. When we look at active voice and passive voice, we look at the verbs that are being used in your writing. So let's start off with active voice. Now, an active voice indicates the subject of the verb is currently acting. Because the subject does or acts upon the verb in such sentences, the sentences are said to be in the active voice. Let's look at some examples where the subject is doing the verb's action. The dog jumped onto the boy. The dog, being the subject, is the one doing the jumping, which is the verb. So the dog jumped. We have an active voice. Christy will give a book report to the class. Christy, who is the subject, is the one doing the giving, the verb. Christy will give a book report because she's actively doing it. That is active. The computer ate my paper. The computer, being the subject, is doing the eating, or the verb. The computer ate your paper. Because it's doing the action currently, it is an active voice. On the opposite tract, a passive voice sentence, the subject and the object flip-flop. The subject becomes the passive recipient of the action. Because the subject is being acted upon or is passive, such sentences are said to be in the passive voice. So let's take a look at some examples of passive voice where the examples show the subject being acted upon by the verb. The boy was jumped on by the dog. Remember our first active voice where the dog jumped on the boy. The dog was doing the action of the jumping. Here it is passive because the boy is not doing the jumping. The boy, subject, was being jumped on by the dog. And so you still have a subject and a verb, but now because the boy is not doing the jumping, it's in passive voice. A book report will be given by Christy to the class. In your active voice, Christy was giving the book report. That was active. She was going to do it. Here it is in passive voice because the book report is not giving Christy to the class. It's in passive voice. The report will be given. My paper was eaten by the computer. Well, if you remember back in active voice, the computer was the one doing the eating of the paper, so that was active voice. The paper is not eating the computer. So this is passive voice. The paper as subject was being eaten, the verb. So now that we know the difference, why do we use them in certain contexts? Well, most writers prefer to use active voice because it's direct. So let's look at the active and passive on the same slide this time. Active. The waiter dropped the tray of food. The waiter is doing the dropping. He is the active one. He's the one doing the event. So that is active. Passive. The tray of food was dropped by the waiter. The food is not dropping the waiter. So therefore, the food is not active here. It is in a passive motion. People also like to use the active voice often because it's less awkward. It clearly states the relationship between a subject and an action. In English, we have a tendency to use a subject first and then to have the verb follow immediately afterwards. That's going to contain an active voice, and so people have a tendency to see the active voice as less awkward and more direct. Let's look at another example. Here's a passive voice. Your request for funding has been denied by the review committee. Where's the active voice? The review committee denied your request for funding. So the active voice sentence pattern propels the reader forward through your writing, thus avoiding weak prose. For example, in our active statement, the review committee is doing the denying. They're the ones who are creating the verb, so they are in the active voice. Your request for funding did not deny the review committee. It's the opposite way around. So because they are passive, they are going to be in the passive voice. All right, well then when should I use the passive voice? In general, the passive voice is less direct, it's less forceful, it's also less concise than the active voice. So maybe perhaps those are the times you'd want to use passive voice. Usually you might use passive voice when you do not know or do not want to reveal the performer of an action. Maybe you're using inferencing or foreshadowing, so you might not want to reveal the direct action itself. You might also want to use passive voice when you want to emphasize the receiver of the action. Maybe perhaps the receiving of the funds on the previous slide was more important to you in person than the committee itself. So sometimes maybe you might want to emphasize the receiver of the action. So here we have an awkward passive and a deliberate passive. Sometimes you don't want to use the passive voice, and sometimes you do. An awkward passive would be, my bicycle is repainted by John. Although it is a correct statement, it seems kind of awkward. You just kind of question, wait, what's getting repainted again? John's getting repainted? A deliberate passive would be, my bicycle was repainted. Now the performer is not mentioned because it's not necessary to get the point across. And here, the emphasis is on the bicycle. We want the bicycle being repainted. We want you to focus on the bicycle. So how do we know when we look at the words themselves? What kind of verbs do you use in passive voice? The passive voice requires a double verb and will always consist of a form of the verb to be and the past participle, usually an en-edt form of another verb. For example, if we look at an active verb, John baked the bread, you have the verb, it is in past tense. In passive, I'm going to use the same verb form, but I need a double verb. I need the form of the verb to be with it. The bread was baked by John. Was is a form of the verb to be. Now, writers should be familiar with the forms of to be, often called linking verbs, so that they can easily identify the passive voice in their work. So when we take a look at common forms of the verbs to be, am, is, are, was, were, be, been, been, there's other ones like do, did, done, could, should, would, but the most common ones you're going to see are the 8 on the screen. Now note the forms of to be in the examples of the verb to kick in the various forms of the passive voice. So we have is kicked, is being kicked, has been kicked, and was being kicked. And then we switch over to the verb to be specifically. Had been kicked, is going to be kicked, will be kicked, can be kicked, and should be kicked. Almost always these are going to be the passive voice. Now, often passive voice sentences will contain a by phrase indicating who or what performed the action. After you get your form of the verb to be and your verb, usually you're going to have the by phrase coming up immediately afterwards. Passive sentences can be easily transformed into active sentences when that object of the preposition by is moved to the subject position in the sentence. For example, if you have the passive line, the cookies were eaten by the children. You can easily make it from passive to active voice by moving that object of the preposition by the children, make it now the subject. So now the active voice would say, the children ate the cookies. The children are doing the eating. It's direct, it's active. Here's another example of passive voice. The tunnels are dug by the gophers. Well, if we move the gophers over to the subject line, active. The gophers dug the tunnels. The gophers are doing the digging and not the tunnels. All right, let's practice and change these sentences below from passive to an active voice. 1. The statue is being visited by hundreds of tourists every year. So the statue is not the one going out and visiting, it's being visited. So let's just switch the tourists to our subject position. So if we want it to be an active for number 1, you might state, hundreds of tourists visit the statue every year. 2. My books were stolen by someone yesterday. Someone is your by preposition, so let's just move someone to the subject to make it active. Someone stole my books yesterday. 3. Your passive sentence. These books had been left in the classroom by a careless student. So if we move the careless student up to the subject, it's going to become active. A careless student left these books in the classroom. 4. A coffee is raised in many parts of Hawaii by plantation workers. So your by preposition by plantation workers, let's move that as the subject. Plantation workers raised coffee in many parts of Hawaii. 5. The house had been broken into by someone while the owners were on vacation. Let's take our by preposition of someone and move it to the subject position to make it active voice. Someone broke into the house while the owners were on vacation. Now these are active voice. Let's change these sentences into passive voice. Number 1, children cannot open these bottles easily. Well, now let's change bottles over to the subject and make children the by in the predicate. These bottles cannot be opened by children easily. 2. Your active sentence. The government built a road outside her door. So let's go ahead and move the road over into the subject area. A road was built by the government right outside her front door. 3. Your active sentence. Mr. Ross broke the antique vase as he walked through the store. Let's put the antique vase as the subject. The antique vase was broken by Mr. Ross as he walked through the store. 4. When she arrived, the changes amazed her. Let's put the changes as the subject in order to create a passive voice. The changes were amazed when she arrived. 5. The construction workers are making the street repairs all month long. Let's change this active voice into passive voice by moving the street repairs as the subject. Street repairs were being made by construction workers all month long. All right, well, that will do it with the active and the passive voice, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by. If you like what you see here, please leave a like and a comment if you'd like to be learning something else. Otherwise, if you could subscribe to the channel, I'd appreciate it. Thanks for stopping by.